Good morning, everyone. We're coming in live from Cape Town. Welcome to our webinar with Carrick Property and in conjunction with Carrick Consult. I've got Louis Venter with us, and today we'll be discussing navigating tax and law with regards to offshore property and investment. And wherever you're coming in from, throughout Africa or the rest of the world, thank you for joining us. A little bit of housekeeping: we will be recording this. Some of you may have experienced a little bit of time confusing messages with our webinar GoToWebinar platform. We apologize for that. There will be a recording going out on this particular webinar, as with most of our webinars, and we will be sending that recording for you. So please don't worry if you do miss anything or you have to go. So as mentioned, I'm going to kind of kick off straight away, and I'm going to introduce our expert in the room today, which is Louis Venter, on our particular topic. Louis holds a BCom law degree, and he's got a graduate LLB, postgraduate LLB, sorry, and he's got a lot of credentials in terms of being the expert in the room from our side. He's the founding director of Fiduciary Services as well, where he spent 8 years, and then took leadership roles up with F&B private clients in Maitland, South Africa. Louis is married with 3 children, and he is coming up for 25 years next week. So congratulations, Louis, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Scott.
Okay, great. So just from our side, you know, just to sort of really give clients, I suppose, a little bit of what's the word I'm looking for? You know, just to, from the complexities of tax and what we're going to talk about today, I just want to give those in the room at the moment some comfort that we are going to talk about the various aspects, from whether you just starting out your journey, or if you already have onshore, offshore structures already in place. So depending on your level of complexity, so whether you have wanting to have a 10-piece puzzle or a 100-piece puzzle, or 1,000-piece puzzle, we'll go through the different levels of complexity and break them down for you, so that you get a better understanding of the different implications of tax and the different jurisdictions, and really just help us. Louis is here today to help us unpack that puzzle, depending on the size of your puzzle and what your vision is from that perspective. So yeah, thank you. I think Louis, just in short, any comments for those of us in South Africa off the back of this budget yesterday?
Yeah, you know, good budgets are boring budgets. You know, so if you're reading it and you're falling asleep, or watching it and falling asleep, know that it's a good budget. You know, we don't want fireworks when we look at budgets and revenue and expenditure, etc. I think from that point of view, was from an economist point of view, I think a very sound budget. From my science, and that's more the taxation and cross-border taxation and estate planning, etc. It was more interesting to see what's not there. You know, so we all know that the Davis Tax Commission brought out lots of proposals a few years ago. You know, and that tends to cause quite a stir. Anything that's got to do with taxation or long-term planning or structuring, etc., surprises is actually quite a problem. And our country tends to sometimes bring a few surprises that affects long-term planning. And there, I think we can take some guidance from the United Kingdom. You know, if they change anything, they tell you 5 years beforehand. They tell you, listen, if you structured your affairs in a certain way, this is the way we intend to change the legislation, you know, and we'll introduce it in the next 3 years or 5 years. And here's an opportunity to change your planning. So luckily, no adverse effects to anybody who's concerned about their estate planning. No increase of the estate duty rate, no increase of the nation's tax rate. Corporate rates are coming down, which we know, from 28 to 27. Unfortunately, they're still keeping that 45% top rate, even though they said in the budget, you know, that it seems they're not getting much revenue from that increase from 41 to 45, and I think we all know why. But yeah, otherwise, I think a very balanced budget with no nasty surprises for any one of us.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. You know, from a South African perspective. I think, you know, just moving into our next sort of really the agenda and the key discussion points about what we're going to discuss today. Firstly, I'm just going to do as the GM of Carrick Property, I'm just going to give you a recap of why I invest in international property, and we're going to have one or two little sort of slight variables to that where I'll bring Louis into that one. And then we're going to just go through the law of the land, which is just really understanding the legal and tax requirements of a particular jurisdiction, because they may differ from UK, France, Mauritius, Germany, etc. Understanding why it's important to structure before you buy, or at least have a very basic understanding or in terms of what the complexities that may lie ahead for you, depending on how big your vision board is. What it means to earn hard currency income from a tax perspective as well, and then just the legal implications that apply when we go into succession planning, as Louis affectionately calls it, passing the baton, which I quite love, you know, in terms of what that means. So these are some of the key discussion points that we will be addressing today. You are welcome to ask any questions during the discussion or of the webinar, and we'll obviously, if we don't get to them during the discussion, we'll certainly attend to them at the end. So please shoot your questions in the chat box as well. And for those of you that have just joined us, we will be recording the webinar. So when we talk about investing into international property, and what's quite important about what we're talking about today is the economic and political stability of each jurisdiction. So, you know, Louis mentioned earlier that, you know, the UK normally forewarns their everybody within a 3 to 5 year period, which allows you to as a first world country, it allows you to get your structures and house in order to make changes to whatever your portfolio sits as it sits. And I think that's important. You know, if you invest in other countries, you may not know what will happen next year, or they announce something and they make an immediate change, and that the implications that lie ahead for you. So, you know, having that stability within a jurisdiction, and in most first world countries that we do, is important. And I think it's important to acknowledge that from our perspective, we look at, through our investment committee, we look at all of our products that we do have in these kind of economic and political stability jurisdictions, as well as their legal or law implications that apply to you. Another one, which we'll obviously talk about, which is the hard currency rental income, which is where your currency exposure comes into play. You know, so if you're considering your succession planning or your retirement planning, and you're looking to earning a rental income when you turn 65 in another country, and what does that mean, and how does that work for you? So externalizing your rands or your kwachas, etc. You know, what does that mean from an African perspective as well? As we know, property is a much more tangible, stable asset class. It's less volatile, and it's a little bit, what's the word? It's a little bit harder to get into, and it's a bit harder to get out of it. It's not like stocks where we can sell and go and on the move. But that sometimes doesn't make for a much more sound investment in the long term as well. The leveraging and the low cost of finance, we've seen now that even though the inflation is on the rise, and we are seeing some of the base rates go up, for example, in the UK, the cost of financing in these jurisdictions is still significantly lower from a prime perspective than our countries within Africa, and therefore that still makes it an attractive offering to use the bank's money at the low interest rates as well. So just an important thing to know. Louis, this is where you and I probably have a little quick chat around providing diversification, because I mean, we can't really skip complexity. So when you have a diverse portfolio across the multiple asset classes, it's important to, I suppose, know that what you're up against, and whether it's onshore and offshore. I mean, any comments on the diversification component from your side?
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, how the boring things tends to be safer. You know, and if you were to ask me, if I were to compare international property, for instance, let's say with Bitcoin, you know, it's all I see as a lawyer, you know, is I see stability around international property, because as we'll see a bit later, you know, you can rely on the law of the land. But imagine you're a lawyer and you try to defend or you try to institute action in a Bitcoin transaction. Just imagine your first port of call. Which court do you go to? Which country do you go to? And we'll speak about that a bit later, when we deal with conflict of laws and different laws that applies, which makes this, which seemingly easy puzzle a little bit more difficult. But as with anything, and I think asset allocation is the same, is, you know, we want things to be simple, and we agree with that. You know, the answer might be simple, but sometimes you have to absorb a little bit of complexity to get to the simple answer on the other side of complexity. And that typically in my world is, I see the primary role of the advisor is to guide people through the complexity into a solution that is still simple. For me, Bitcoin, for instance, would be complex. Property would be simple because we understand that it's real, it's there, etc. So always a very, very good asset class to have, and I can't imagine any of my clients not having that in their portfolios.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to note, you know, during this whole conversation and what we're having is the importance of somebody to hold your hand and guide you through this process, and that's obviously the services through Carrick Property and Carrick Consult that you represent, obviously, that we do, that falls under the Carrick Wealth banner or Carrick Group. The other one is long-term wealth generation, and I suppose the question for me, well, how long is long-term? I mean, what does that mean? You know, just unpack that one for me, because, you know, a lot of people say, well, I want to leave it to my children, or, you know, what, you know, but how and where and etc.
Yeah, it's we all know when we're young, you know, your parents feels like they age is older than you. You know, so let's say that the age difference between our parents is typically 22 to 25 to 27 years, somewhere in that line, depending if you're the oldest or the youngest of the brood. But as you grow older, you know, we all laugh, you know, say, well, I'm becoming my father, or I'm becoming my mother, etc., etc. And it's just because of the relative time difference is shortening. And then I've yet to meet an older client that doesn't tell me, listen, time actually flies, you know, just make use of every second you've got, you know. So what they're actually saying is the space between generations is actually quite short. So when you do long-term planning in my science, you typically do planning across 3 or 4 scenarios, or 3 or 4 generations. So at one single time, you've got 3 or 4 generations living at the same period. You've got the great-grand, the kid and the grandkid, you know, all living at the same time, which makes for an interesting phenomenon, and something that we've picked up over the years, and that is, can we predict factors that makes for good succession? You know, so if we know, and you can't cheat death, you know, it's one of those things you can't dodge it. You know, it's there for all of us, you know, and it's a reason to celebrate life, because we're going to die. But in that, we know there's inevitable transfer of wealth. And scientifically, what we're seeing is this phenomenon where you've got one generation that tends to amass knowledge, then you've got another one that tends to amass wealth, and then something breaks in between. And you get this repetitive cycle of wealth being built and wealth being lost. And that's scientifically proven and shown to be correct. And the question really is, why is that? And is there a bit of science behind that? And not wanting to take too much time on that, but I think it's a good intro for let's say, that the bigger scheme of things of what we are busy with. So the moment we talk about wealth and transfer of wealth and building assets and building wealth, etc., and the transfer thereof, what you're busy with is you're actually busy with building up a momentum process that's going to be transferred from one generation to the next. And the moment one understands that, there's a few rules that actually becomes very apparent, and you'll see it as we go through the discussion today. One of the rules, for instance, is that you have to make peace with your mortality, which means if you were, for instance, in a relay race and you're a relay runner, you would know you're in a relay race. It sounds very simple, but it's actually quite important. And say, all right, so with regards to the wealth that I've got, or that what I build up, you know, I can either be a custodian, so I've got the responsibility of transferring that to the next generation, or I could be an owner, which means that I own to the exclusion of others, which includes the family members that is going to survive me and to whom the wealth is going to go. So in the same breath, your second generation typically needs to do things. You know, they firstly, like the relay runner at the second base, they usually look back over their shoulders towards the first runner, which means there's good communication. there's usually an open hand and say, well, I accept this responsibility, etc., which for me translate into great conversations happening between generations. And the third is, before you take the baton, that second runner starts running already. So there's a transfer of momentum. It's not just a baton where somebody stands still and the other one just dumps it on him. There's a momentum process. And then the last one is, if you get the baton, you must run looking forward and not looking back, not trying to resolve issues of the past. And in that, I think there's a lot of magic, and that for the clients around the table, that is your job. We can guide you with that. We can discuss that with you. We've got the benefit of years and years and years of building these puzzles for families. You might only build your own, but on a yearly basis, we sit with, let's say, 40 or 50 scenarios that we have to puzzle together, and we can give you guidance on that. Yeah. But the key factor here is, and this is what we're going to do today, Scott, is that the driving force behind good succession or good planning is the quality of conversations. One of those conversations happens within a family, but then the other happens between us as advisors and the clients. And the idea is to enrich those discussions as far as possible to make a meaningful difference.
Yeah. So when we kind of go straight into this, because this talks to, as more of our clients, I mean, I think the dual diaspora where we talk there, we're looking at about exporting of our assets, and also on top of that, in line with your conversation about passing the baton, our children are also exporting in essence because they're studying elsewhere, etc. And so typically, what does that mean? So if someone is studying, one of my children is studying in the UK and I own a property, at what point, and I want to buy another one, do I keep it in my name? Do I put it in a trust? Do I put it in their name? And these are the complexities as we go in. So, in terms of the law of the land and some of the topics we've got underneath here, maybe just give us some context as to why this is important and how do we deal with it.
Yeah, it's from the 80s. What you saw is two things, with South Africans, and I think that is just part of the political and socioeconomic reality of the country. And again, I don't put any personal weight on it. It's just that it's a fact. We know that there's a fair amount of wealth being externalized from the country, going into first world countries, or going into hard currency, or just going into countries where you can get access to more modern investment companies and ideas, etc. So that is simply a fact, and that's happening. All right. So if you've got the puzzle and saying, well, everything is in South Africa that I own and all my children are here, you've got a fairly simple, well-known piece of puzzle. So let's say it's a 10-piece of puzzle. Now you've got assets abroad. You start externalizing your wealth. You're starting to use your 10 million per year, etc. You and your spouse might do it. You might actually include the children. That immediately puts about 20 pieces to that puzzle. All right, it's still a puzzle and it still needs to be built. It's just slightly more complex. Now you go to the third and say, well, my children are starting to study abroad, all right, or getting a green card in the US, or starting a career somewhere else, etc., which is a reality. We see that. We see the professional middle class going into other countries where there's better opportunities or there's better pay or whatever. That's just a fact. Even your investment takes you offshore, for instance. So you've got investments into Mauritius that gives you the right to habitate in Mauritius. Same with the UK or other jurisdictions that allows you to invest for citizenship or for residency rights. So in this normal scenario where you've got this 4 generations running this race, all right, all that you're doing is it just becomes more complex. So you can't skip that because somebody has to build the puzzle at some point in time. The best guide to build the puzzle is yourself with help, all right? And the more complex it gets, those of us who love puzzle building, if you get a 2,000 piece, you get everybody together and say, well, come and help us. Let's build this puzzle. Let's say it's on a holiday, etc., etc. But with a 10-piece puzzle, you're going to do it yourself. A minor child can build a 10-piece puzzle, etc. So what the diaspora does, and this dual diaspora does, is it introduces complexity into our planning. And I'm not saying difficulty. As I said to you before, Scott, you know, there's things for me that's difficult. You know, I don't understand how my TV works. I still don't get it. All right, and that for me is difficult. All right, but complex just means there's quite a few things that you need to consider. It just means that it's the same puzzle, just with more pieces that you need to put in. Now, if you leave that till death, what happens is your poor executor needs to build a puzzle without the picture. So my kid always used to do that. You know, he would take a 10-piece puzzle and he would build it about 100 times, and then he'd get bored, and then he'll turn the pieces around and he'll build the puzzle just on the form. Now that typically is what you create. If nobody knows what you have, they don't know where it is, you haven't applied your mind as to exactly the structure where it needs to be in. It's like asking somebody else to build a puzzle with the puzzle pieces upside. Now try that with a 2,000-piece puzzle. You'll understand it gets a bit more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the conflict of laws, and we talk about place of asset, persons, transactions, and choice. In layman's terms, what does that mean from our perspective?
Right, very simply put, you know, each country is sovereign, and we see that now with Ukraine, and it's very in our minds. You know, we always think of countries as absolutely sovereign because we don't know war. And it was 100 years ago that countries just came in and took other countries. And with that means that in every jurisdiction you are introduces its own laws. So the moment you've got assets that move into other jurisdictions, or you've got heirs that move into other jurisdictions, what you're also then including is the complexity of having not just South African law apply to that, but you've got international law, which means it's other countries' legal systems that might apply to your ownership of the asset, or the contract that you're entering into, or the rights with regards to a trust, or the way a company functions, or the taxation thereof, etc. And the science of the conflict of laws, which is quite a tricky subject, is trying to understand what the interplay is between different countries' legal systems, and if there is a cross-border question, which law answers that question. So usually what happens with conflict of laws, and the easiest one, and this is what we're discussing today, is property. The moment you've got bricks and mortar, all right, it's very clear. The country in which those bricks and mortar are situated is the country's law that applies to that. Take the same example. Somebody in the United Kingdom buys property in South Africa. All right, we always think of it the other way around. But South African law would apply to who's got title to that property, who has to pay tax on that property, what happens with the rent, what is the conditions for a rental agreement. We've got specific laws that applies to lease agreements, etc. Those are the laws then that applies, even though the owner of it might be a UK citizen. And this really is where the conflict of laws comes in. So this is more puzzle blocks in this box of ours. It adds a few. And you'll see later, you know, one shouldn't guess the law. So there should be a fair amount of clarity. The more solid your investment is, the more solid the legal rules that applies to that. And I would rank on top would be fixed property. So fixed property, I know as an estate planner, I know what laws applies. Yeah. All right. The moment you get to the other scale, if I have to plan around Bitcoin, I wouldn't know where to start. To be quite honest with you, and I've been doing this job for 25 years, I wouldn't know where to start, because you don't even know what the nature of the asset is, whether it's a currency, whether it's an investment, etc. So you're at sea with regards to understanding the laws that apply. Where if somebody doesn't pay over the coins I've got in a wallet, where do I go to? Which court? Is it Hong Kong? Is it China? Is it South Africa? Is it where is it? You know, is it where the broker is, etc. Now, if you go to that with any lawyer, doesn't matter which quality law firm, they're going to say, well, you know, your guess is as good as mine. We're going to try a few things. With property, it's easy. You know, if the property is situated in a certain place, the law there applies. The laws of the station, however, it makes it a bit more difficult as well, because if you've got fixed property in a certain place, the law of the station might apply. Now, one of the things we take for granted as well in this country is freedom of the station. We say, well, I can do with my stuff as I want. And it's true for South Africa. South Africa is one of the few countries that's got absolute freedom of the station. If you're in the UK, for instance, Scott, and you just go across the border to Scotland, there isn't freedom of the station. If you go a bit east to France, they run by the Côte d'Azur. There's no freedom of the station. Same with Spain, same with Portugal. So England itself has got freedom of the station, so you're much safer there. But you need to understand what laws apply to that asset I've got to understand what you need to put in place.
Well, can you give me a practical example of owning a property in Scotland versus England?
So a property in Scotland, for instance, so let's say, for instance, that I'm married, like I am, and I've got 3 kids, all right? But I decide my property in Scotland, because my wife is getting enough in South Africa, etc. And let's say, for instance, I've got a sister in London, which I do, and I want to leave that property to her. In terms of Scottish law, there's a compulsory 12.5% of my estate that has to go to my spouse. So I cannot disinherit my spouse. All right, if I were Mauritius, for instance, all right, which is another popular property jurisdiction for South Africans, there's no freedom of the station. A compulsory portion must go to your children, for instance, and we know anything that goes to my children is subject to estate duty. So now in my planning, what I do is I say, well, I want everything to go to my spouse, which is normal. The Mauritians will say, it's fixed property here. You are bound by the laws of Mauritius with regards to the succession of that asset, and we're telling you, you cannot disinherit your children. By giving everything to your spouse, you've disinherited your children. We are going to give a compulsory portion to your kids, and the rest goes to your spouse, and there goes your planning. All right, whatever you had in mind simply cannot happen. Yeah. And that's the type of problems you get into. It's not difficult. You must just understand them and say, well, if you are in a certain jurisdiction, you're going to invest there. What is the consequences thereof?
And when we talk about tax, I suppose there's really a process of elimination in going through. So when you say, okay, well, I'm looking at the UK and you use France and Mauritius as other examples, but if we're looking at the UK as an example, and we said, okay, well, what are the processes of elimination that we would look at versus how we are familiar in South Africa? And maybe this is maybe a perfect time to move on to the next slide with reference to, just structuring before you buy and then understanding the hard currency income before we go on to the next one. But, this slide for me is probably the big nugget out of this conversation that we're having today, which is really, well, if do I use a trust in the UK, or and does the same rules apply in South Africa? And as we know, it doesn't, and they view differently, and therefore we would say, okay, well, maybe a trust doesn't work in the UK because of X, Y, and Z, versus we know it works for us in South Africa. So really, for me, I think the important thing in your wealth planning and in your property purchases is understanding the implications of tax in those different jurisdictions, and which one, how can you eliminate them through the process? Does that make sense?
It does. This slide does. It gives away our cheat sheet. So as estate planners, this is our hassle map. This is what we're trying to solve. And just to link up to the conversation with regards to that wealth relay, or the relay race that's run between the generations, and just moving from something that we think is simple through the complexity and get to a simple answer again at the other side of complexity. That baton you hold, I can break that baton into 4 pieces, and you can only hold assets in one of these 4 silos. All right, there isn't more. This is a complete number. So you can either hold assets in trust, or you can hold it in your estate, or you can hold it in a company or a corporate form of some sort, or you can hold it in a pension or a life product. Now, each of these silos has got different rules, and it is different with regards to whether you've got offshore assets or onshore assets, and whether you've got offshore heirs and onshore heirs. And what we typically try to do is we try to plot asset for asset that what you hold, and it might be that let's say for the layman out there, I'd say, well, my assets in legal terms for me might mean, all right, but if you've got assets in a trust, it's not my assets. If you're saying my assets, it belongs to your estate. and it is subject to your marital regime, and it is something that I'm going to deal with in your will. If you've got a share portfolio offshore and it lies in an offshore trust, it means the trustees of those trusts actually own the property. They manage and control it. It's not part of your estate for estate duty purposes. It's not subject to your marital regime. And there's a different way in which those assets are dealt with, and there's different tax consequences to that. Same with a company. If you've got company assets, it means the directors of the company hold it. If I own my home in a company and I own the shares, I can't in my will say that I hereby bequeath my property to John. I must say I bequeath the shares of my company to John. And then there's a difference whether those shares in that company sits in your estate or it sits in your trust. And then that last bucket, the pension, is there's pension fund trustees that looks after it. You can nominate beneficiaries, etc. But this is the only way you can hold your assets in one of those forms, and it's fairly globally recognized. But now, for instance, you want to buy property in France. The moment you want to buy property in France, for instance, you cannot use a trust. Why? Because France does not recognize a trust as a vehicle in which you can own assets. They don't recognize it. They don't recognize the instrument. So now it's out of the place. So whether you think it's a good idea to put it in trust or not, the law will tell you can't. All right. If you've got property in the UK and say, well, UK recognizes trust, so let's put it in a trust, and say, all right, you can, it's possible, but is it the best plan? And there you might say, well, it isn't, because in a trust, every 10 years, your assets are in a trust. It's as if you die and they levy an estate duty on that. All right. So they figured out the estate duty escape that sits in the trust long ago. I hope we don't follow. That's what I've been watching the budget speeches for to see where we go that route. Yeah. Right. So there, all of a sudden you say, well, it might be better to just own it in your own hands. If you take exactly that same example and you apply it to Mauritius, I would be the first to tell you, listen, there's only one way to own that asset, and that's in a trust. Why? Because there's forced heirship in Mauritius. For that simple fact, we have to put it in a trust. So it's the same transaction, it's the same family, it's the same participants, it's a different jurisdiction, and your answer changes. Yeah. So for this, there's no cookie cutters. You have to work your way through the complexity here to get to a simple answer. So your simple question might be, okay, Louis, but I'm buying a property in the UK, how should I own it? And my answer might be, I think you should own it in your own hands. But just understand that in getting to that answer, an advisor needs to absorb this complexity here before he can give you that answer. And that is where we're saying, you know, get guys to help you build this puzzle. Guys who understand it, that's seen this puzzle before, etc. We see this puzzle on a daily basis, over and over and over again, and there's patterns. So if your question on the UK, for instance, with fixed property, you know, my go-to is, I think number one, you should own it yourself. All right, and if you're married, you should own it yourself with joint tenancy, which is something we don't know in South Africa. So joint tenancy means I co-own something with somebody, and whoever survives between the two of us is the eventual owner. And we don't have that in South Africa. It's not part of our legal system, but it's available in the UK. The second is, if you don't go that, you go a company and saying, well, if I'm going to rent the property out, etc., let's set up a company so that I know that taxation effects will be in the UK and it will not complicate my South African tax return. All right. And the third one, if there's really good reasons, I would put it in the company shares in the trust, but that would be exactly opposite would happen for a Mauritian scenario, for instance.
And I think again, it talks, you know, you're talking about one property, but we've got quite a few of our clients that are in repeat, what I call repeat business, or, where they're looking to build a portfolio where they might look at 5 to 10 plus properties. You know, what is the opinion? Let's use that exact same example where this is just you know, obviously the objective is build a portfolio and have a particular vision. How would you view that now, where we just spoke about one property in those different jurisdictions? How would you view building a portfolio in the same breath?
The moment you build a portfolio, you know, usually it's not something you just want to live in. It's something that's going to earn yield. And the moment you're in that yield environment, the company has your best structure globally. You know, so immediately, because of the way you want to own the properties and what you're going to use it for, and if it's for yield, it defaults to the company. Then the question still is whether those company shares are held in your own name in the trust, and there are default, if it's in the UK, I default for that company to be owned in your own estate. And it might be, if you've got property around the globe, that you might use different silos for different properties. All right, so if you're in Mauritius, you would place the property directly in the trust. If in the UK, you would have put it in the company, and your company shares would be owned in the trust. That makes property a bit more difficult. If your question was, for instance, related to passive investments, I would say, well, you can use one vehicle. Just put that vehicle in the right place, and that typically sits somewhere in the Channel Islands, etc., and have that own the property, or not the property, the investments, etc. But when it comes against bricks and mortar, introduces the law of the land, and because of that, you might want to structure it differently for different jurisdictions, or group similar jurisdictions or types of laws into one structure.
And I suppose what becomes important here is obviously, and you mentioned the yield, because that's, you know, as you accumulate more property, you're going to accumulate more rental income, and you essentially going to have a bigger portfolio. So where does, at the end of that, when you're passing over the baton, from an inheritance perspective, how does that position things if you're owning one property versus a company with a portfolio of properties?
Yeah, that's the trick, you know, is if you're leaving your assets to the next generation, you know, you need to apply whatever you want to do to each of these silos. So with a trust, my big succession question is, who's going to be the trustees? Who knows about the asset? Is there a protector there, etc.? South African letter of authority, a very good test, for instance, is just take your letter of authority you've got and scratch out your name. Right, and usually it's husband, wife, and an independent somewhere, right? But they rarely have meetings, and they rarely know each other, because somebody just said you need an independent. Now, just take that, scratch your names. That's the person who's in full control of the trust. All right, so it's just a test. If it's in your will, if it's in your estate, you know, the question is, but can your South African estate and your South African executor deal with that asset? And with bricks and mortar, the chance are 9 out of 10 times no. So if you own property in the UK, that together with that goes, you have to do a will in the UK, and you have to direct what happens there, and you need to make sure that that will is drafted in line with the UK legislation and law on succession. Same with the company and same with the pension. You can't leave one out. So you can't say, well, my estate planning equals doing a will. All right, in my will, you get about a 2 out of 10 for your effort. All right, because I'm saying, well, you know, there's a part of this baton that you actually didn't apply your mind to. A pension, for instance, the brilliant offshore pension fund products that you guys have, etc. For instance, you need to nominate beneficiaries. You know, who applies their mind, who should be the beneficiary. If you've got an heir living in the US, who've got a green card, is it good for them to be a beneficiary of such a pension fund? You know, who figured out the tax consequence for that beneficiary? So each one of these silos, your wish needs to be applied across all 4, and that in my world is your advisor's job. That's why you go to an advisor, and the advisor needs to apply his mind to the complexity and then find a solution for you that's simple again, but it not cheat the process of absorbing a fairly complex question.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what we said right at the beginning, depending on your vision and what your objectives are, you know, and I think I also like your analogy is whoever's part of your vision, you almost need to bring into that, onto the same table, and have a discussion about what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. Because I think the important aspect there is that you say, you know, one thing we always certain of is death of taxes, so to speak, and it's going to come, and trying to build the puzzle without the vision board is extremely difficult.
Yeah, and you're right. It's impossible for me or for you, Scott, to know everything. You know, so typically what smart firms do is they've got a mixed skill set, so that you get all the angles of advice that you need applied to the client. Which I think in this instance, the more difficult the puzzle becomes, the more people you need to get to help you build it. You know, still the same puzzle. It's not something different, etc. It's just more pieces, more complexity, and you just sometimes need more people around the table. And the better those get along, The worst thing is to try to build a puzzle where everybody's fighting with each other over pieces. So what you really want is a good team around the table and saying, right, we'll help you build the puzzle. And in the end, if the puzzle is built well, we just know that succession works well as well. It's just one of those things. If you care for your stuff and you put a bit of effort into it, etc., the succession usually is without a hitch.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that takes us on to our next slide, which is, I don't know if there's anything else you want to comment on around these 4 silos before we move on to the next one.
Happy.
Okay, so when we talk about the succession planning component, and I know we're sort of heading towards the end of this, and I think we, from our perspective, it's very difficult to dive into too much detail because everyone's situation is different, and as we've alluded to, you've got different sizes of puzzle, and again, those puzzles might be in different jurisdictions. So it's important that, from your succession perspective and the issues that come at, when we look at your first statement about figuring out the puzzle between the conflict of laws, the wishes and the laws that apply to those who inherited, there is a key aspect. If I've got family in Australia, I've got a property in the UK, based on that, what happens, as an example?
Yeah, it's and before we go almost to the technical side, it is just important that when you faced with this complexity in your own family, the more you as a family discuss this, the better. And one of the things we're getting, for instance, you might have a kid that stays in the US or starting to study there, they start to get a green card, etc. In your mind, everybody is going to inherit equally, and one of the things you're going to give to that kid in America is a distribution out of your South African trust. Now, just to give you some idea of the issues there, in the USA, if you get a distribution from a trust that's not in the US, and let's say the trust has been in existence for 20 years, and you've amassed the wealth over 20 years, the moment you make a distribution, what they do is they've got what they call a throwback rule. So they go and open up your kids' tax returns from the day they become a US citizen, and they attribute portions of that which you distributed to their income tax returns, and then they levy tax and penalties on that. Their logic is, well, if it's a discretionary trust, it means you were entitled to it, you just didn't declare it, and they open it up. If you were going to got a kid living in Australia, for instance, anything over and above the base capital that you gave into the trust, they levy a 45% income tax on in Australia. So now you do the following: you leave your assets from your estate to the trust, and then from the trust you distribute it to the kid in Australia. So what have you done to your capital? Well, number one, you've taken 20% hit on the estate duty. And then on that, what is left, you're going to pay a 45% tax. The heir is going to pay 45% tax in Australia. If you just left it directly from your will to the kid, it wouldn't have happened. So if you want to treat your children equally, for instance, you have to do those numbers and see, all right, so what is the tax consequence of one of my heirs or beneficiaries receiving this? And again, it's just, you won't know if you don't know, and you won't know if you don't ask. But that's why the big thing for us is you don't guess the law, and that comes with the conflicts of law, but you definitely don't guess maths. You do the maths and say, and it's possible. It's possible to do it during your lifetime and say, all right, if I'm saying I leave all my assets to my children, whichever silo there is, what does it mean? What is the net number they're going to get? And that is definitely calculatable. It's possible to give that number. You just need to build the puzzle.
Yeah, and I think, just listening to you, I think that, as we said, we don't know everything, but we certainly have access to various experts in different fields, and applying the law in different countries, especially when you're purchasing property. I mean, it's quite a daunting subject. When you talk to a lot of clients when they're buying their first home, just not even an investment property, it's a big thing, and it's a big step, regardless of your age and when you buy it, and what time of your life. And I think that just by the whole concept of understanding what is the best way and talking to the right people, and because your neighbor's advice, all due respect to any of my neighbors, isn't necessarily always the right advice, because that was whatever they discussed about is fits their mold, and doesn't necessarily fit yours and apply to yours. So I think
by going to the same doctor and then swapping pills thereafter.
Exactly. So I think, on that note, I'm obviously conscious of time. I think just for those of you that have any questions, you're welcome to send them directly to us via email. As I mentioned, you will get a recording of this webinar. Louis, thank you very much for your time. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add before I finish off.
If there's questions, love to field them. But otherwise, get in contact with us if this is the complexity you face. This is what we do. We solve the complexity. Yeah,
and I think it's important to note that as you alluded to, everyone's different, and if you're buying a property in the UK, France, Mauritius, Germany, etc., I think it's important to understand what your objectives and your goals and your vision are. If you're wanting to buy one and you're happy with one, or you're wanting to buy 3, or you're wanting to buy 10. I think either way, it's important to understand what rules are going to apply in those jurisdictions, what the tax implications are, from an income perspective, and is there double taxation agreements between the countries when you bring that back, and also inheritance as well. So it's important to understand those and where you purchase, and I think it's important to discuss with the likes of Carrick Consults and ourselves before you make that step, and that's why we essentially just wanted to put that out there today to all of you. You're welcome to contact me directly, and I will pass those questions on to Louis at scott.irving@carrick-property.com, and my cell number there is 082-465-8444. You can drop me a WhatsApp or whatever works for you. That'd be great. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Louis, for your time and effort today. Much appreciated. Thank you to all of you for joining us from wherever you are. You will be receiving a recording which you can share with your friends or family. And if you have any questions, give us a shout. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.